Hi.
Hi, everyone. So
Hello.
this is not a webinar style because we wanted people to be able to ask questions, but we will try and control it because obviously there's a lot of people on here. So I'm Danielle Wain from Seven Lakes Alliance is going to give Whitney's getting himself on at the moment. So we'll give him a couple minutes to get himself sorted and then we'll get started.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. I want to be up to here. So if you need to turn it on, go ahead. Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing. What's that? But I don't know what I'm doing. Oh, no.
So I'm actively muting everyone so we don't have background noise. If you do have a question, unmute yourself actively. Also, we can use the chat window for asking questions if you prefer.
Hello, Danielle.
Hi, Jody.
Hi, Jim. Oh, I guess I should open with my video. I don't know what I look like right now, though. Ooh, nice background, Jim. Back in the day. Just kidding. Luke. Carter, how you doing, buddy? You look good.
Okay, I see Whitney's on. So I don't know if Jody, do you want to maybe introduce briefly what the purpose of what we're doing tonight is?
I don't know what it is. I'm just kidding.
You're the one who suggested we have a Q&A session, and I think, well,
Hold on, I gotta have you louder.
The purpose of tonight is we've had two, at the North Pond Association meeting, Whitney gave a presentation. Last week I gave a presentation, but they're very much like one-way kind of interactions. And so based on Whitney's presentation and my presentation, there's been a bunch of questions that have come in. And so we're going to we were sent a bunch of questions ahead of time. So we'll start by answering those. And then we'll kind of open up the floor for, basically hope to wrap up by 8.
So Danielle is part of our, if you don't mind me interjecting, Danielle, Dr. Danielle Wain is the Seven Lakes Alliance scientist, a lake scientist, water quality scientist. I don't know your exact title, but I know you're a scientist.
Science director.
Yeah, science director. So she is on our science committee and she is helping us collect data, necessary data that we need to move forward with any kind of, information we need to move forward with any kind of remediation in the next year or so. Whitney's on now, Danielle.
So, yep. Okay. So
I'm hiding myself.
okay. So yeah, so first we were sent a bunch of questions. So Whitney and I are just going to, I'll answer some of them, Whitney will answer some of them. We're kind of coordinating on the go, if you will. Whitney, you're on all okay, right?
Yeah, do we just want to share the Google Doc as our shared screen so people can sort of read it as we go through it?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, some of them, the answers aren't complete yet. They're more stuff that we're like, well, I'm not 100% sure. Do you think it's
That would be, I mean, that would be okay. Or do we want to, so we are happy to share the doc at the end with everyone so that you have, so we have the questions, we have some answers. Why don't we just go through them now, and then at the end, we'll share them with Jody. So you'll have a written summary
Okay.
at the end for anyone that wasn't able to participate. And the other reason is that people don't have to feel like they're taking notes on the fly, because it will be, you'll have it in your hand within 24 hours.
yeah. And this is being recorded as well, just so you know, just that way we
Okay.
can, people do
Did you
want
make sure? Press it.
I see it. It says recording in the corner.
Okay. Oh, I see it.
Okay, so yeah, we might as well get started because there's a lot of questions to get through, and great to see such a big crowd. I know people are really concerned about what's going on in North Pond and have lots of questions. The first question is it safe to do our dishes and shower using the pond water? So is it safe is a broad question, but Seven Lakes Alliance began doing toxin testing last week, and for those who may not have heard, the toxin testing that we did came back negative. We are only testing for one toxin, which is the one that the DEP says is most likely to be found in Maine, but it doesn't mean that there's no chance whatsoever of other ones. But so it's a toxin called microcystin, which we're testing for. Those tests came back negative last Thursday. We're going to test again this Thursday. So the good news is, as of now, we haven't detected toxins, but you still need to be cautious when the water looks the way it does. So in terms of doing dishes, if you're drying off your dishes completely, you know, the thing is you don't want to ingest water. So anything you can do to avoid ingesting water is what you need to do. So washing dishes, if you dry them off well, you're probably fine. Showering, some people have no choice but to use the lake water. And we know that if you don't have to use the lake water, that's great. You should do that. But if you do have to, you should really try and keep your showers as short as possible. And that's just because showers, they create aerosols, right? So there's droplets of water in the air, which can contain cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae, which can contain the toxins as well if they're present. Like, we haven't detected them yet, but things can change quickly. So that was what I would recommend in terms of dishes and showering. Whitney, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that we're testing once a week, and this is a toxin that accumulates in the liver over a long period of time. Once a week's sort of a practical threshold for testing, but if the bloom were to get significantly worse between testing, that would argue that people need to be more cautious. So they just need to look out in front of their camp. And if there's a really thick, scummy layer, then you should take more precautions. And if the bloom tends to thin out a little bit, then that probably means the water's better. I mean, there's a little bit of common sense here that needs to be applied, and we'll keep testing throughout the summer once a week. And we'll post those results on the Seven Lakes Alliance website. Danielle, is that right?
So Thursday after I do the testing, and hopefully at some point we'll start incorporating North Pond Association members in the science committee that will be formed to help do the testing as well. So we'll be able to disseminate. We'll get them posted as soon as we have results. And of course, if we detect anything, we'll contact Jody immediately, in addition to DEP, et cetera. But yes, that's the plan, and hopefully we'll keep seeing negative results for the rest of the summer, but things can change quickly. So, and like I said, if you do have questions, it's probably easier at this point because there's so many people to write your question in the chat window, because that does pop up, but then we can, if you have follow-up questions to the question we just answered, otherwise we'll save new questions till the end. Let's see. So is there a way to see where the largest deposits of phosphorus are coming into the lake? So that question's basically asking us to understand the phosphorus loading. Is it coming from outside the lake, inside the lake? Is it coming from septics? Is it coming from the watershed? All these things. And this is actually the crux of the work that needs to be done to help determine a management plan. And there's a lot of data we still need to collect because this lake is more complicated than East Pond, basically. And so we have a lot of data already, but we don't have it all. But the first thing is reducing obvious erosion and watershed runoff sites is going to need to be a part of any management plan that happens. And so that can get started straight away. We don't have to sit there and wonder if the watershed's a bigger source than the sediments. You just start working on it, in terms of your own properties. And then there's, roads, et cetera, that as an association need to be addressed on a larger scale. So that's why it's challenging to figure out where all the phosphorus is coming from. That's the science work that needs to be done.
So I'll just add that I was talking to Lynn Matson, who's preparing for a presentation on Great Pond, and he said, the simplest way to think about this is if you see dirt entering the lake, you've got an external loading problem. That's right. So if you can see sediment or runoff of camp roads entering the lake, you've got a problem. That's the most obvious. And you can have other sources that are less clear, but if you see a sediment plume entering the pond, boy, that's a flag that is a significant source of phosphorus. And the other thing that we should mention is that the internal load tends to happen in a very short period of time, and that's what can often trigger a bloom. So you can have one load that's 50% of the lake, but if it's distributed over a long period of time, you end up getting a small amount of phosphorus entering every day. But if you have another 50%, which is coming in 3 weeks, it can add a lot of phosphorus in a hurry. And so we not only need to determine how much is coming in from all the different sources, but what the timing is, because the timing is what tends to trigger the blooms. So that's challenging. As Danielle said, that's the crux of the problem. That's the crux of the scientific discovery that needs to happen to have a management plan to solve the problem.
So next question is an easy one, and that's just whether or not we can post your talk somewhere, Whitney.
And I thought we had already done that. Jody, did you not get a copy of my talk?
Did you send it to me?
I think so. I think I sent it to you, and I certainly posted it on the Google Drive, which you have access to. And so the answer is yes, of course we can share it. And now it's just a matter of us figuring out how to get it to you. And I think you asked me if you wanted it in PDF or PowerPoint, and I think I sent it as a PDF. So anyway, we'll circle back after this call and make sure the presentation is available to whoever wants it, and then I'll leave it to the North Pond Association to figure out how you disseminate it to your members. It's perfectly okay to put it on your website.
Okay, so the next question is, do alewives eat algae, and is that an option on the table? So Whitney's gonna take a stab at that one.
Yeah, so alewives certainly eat algae. They don't tend to like blue-green algae. They tend to like green algae. This question's really related to the bigger biomanipulation question, and if you remember back to 2011, East Pond did a biomanipulation not by adding alewives, which turns out to be a huge permitting issue, but by removing perch, sorry. And so they did a perch removal where they commercially netted the perch. And the idea was that if they took out the perch, the zooplankton, which are small, free-floating animals, thus the zoo in the zooplankton. So the idea was that you took out the perch, which gave you bigger zooplankton, and the zooplankton ate the algae. Problem is, it didn't work. We're not entirely sure why. I think the biggest reason is that the Anabina, which was the species that's blooming in the lake, the zooplankton didn't like the Anabina, and so even with more zooplankton, and there wasn't a remediation. So is bioremediation, which is what you do when you add fish or take away fish, a management option? The answer is yes. It has worked in some lakes, but it hasn't worked in our main lakes. And if you want to go on and look in more detail, sea-run alewives have been debated in lakes like China Lake. So there's a lot of literature out there, and it's worth considering, but I wouldn't hang your hat on this being a solution. Okay, I think Danielle, you got the next question, which is,
Can fish live through this?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Maybe I should have let you. So I'm not a fish biologist, but from my understanding, some fish just are totally fine being in this. Like I believe bass don't really care. You're really, you know, the kind of fish like trout and salmon that are more kind of, well, it depends who's doing the valuing. From an ecological perspective, you know, they wouldn't thrive well in this, but they're not really fish that are found in North Pond anyway, because it's not deep or cold enough. So you can certainly, if all the oxygen is depleted, the fish will not be happy. But you don't get to that point in North Pond because it does keep mixing. So so the fish will live through this. Maybe not the best species of fish, but fish that are adapted to poor water quality, of which there are many. I don't. Would you have something add about that? You fish. I'm not.
Nope,
a fish
that's true. That the fish, the bass in particular, seem to do quite well. When East Pond was blooming badly, they were still catching a lot of bass.
So I think I'll take the next one, and because there's a couple that Whitney's going to take after. So once a major bloom like this occurs, is it more likely to occur in future years? And the answer to that is yes. And that is partially because, you have all this algae, it's all going to die and just sink to the bottom of the lake. And they're going to have all this organic matter. And when organic matter decays, it consumes oxygen. So that's just kind of priming the sediments already for next summer when we start getting some stratification in warm periods, just ready to go to suck up the oxygen and then have phosphorus be released. So that's one of the cycles, these feedback loops that the lakes get into. As part of it is this generation of all this organic matter, which contributes to anoxia the next summer. And even over the winter, possibly we saw that this winter, where we saw a lot of phosphorus in the water already in the spring, possibly because organic matter from last year. So do you have anything to add to that, Whitney?
Well, just that if we use East Pond as a model, once East Pond started to bloom on a regular basis, it pretty much bloomed every year. It's interesting that North Pond has bloomed occasionally, but then it had periods of, up to 10 years where it didn't have a bloom. And so it's concerning that we've really had essentially 4 years, even though last year wasn't quite as bad. It was very close to what we would define as a bloom. So I think we're in a cycle now that is going to continue for quite a while.
So the next question is, what are the qualifications of the person doing the initial assessment for us? So that's Ken Wagner. And also, what types of data will he need to review and assess? So Whitney's going to take this.
Yeah, so Ken Wagner is a biologist. He got his PhD at Dartmouth in plankton ecology, and he has spent his career managing and remediating lakes. He's actually very close to retirement. He keeps trying to retire, and then somebody calls him up and tries to talk him out of going into retirement. So that's something to be aware of. But he's worked mostly in Massachusetts because that's where he lives. And particularly now, it's very hard to travel. So he's been focusing on his lakes that he's been doing in Massachusetts. Having said that, I think he likes working in Maine. He was a great asset on the East Pond edition by providing knowledge on what different treatment options are available. So a lot of the data and the analysis of internal versus external load, shoreline condition, we can do between Colby and the Seven Lakes Alliance and the North Pond Association Science Committee. There's a lot of fundamental boots on the ground work that needs to be done, and that can be done locally. Where Ken is incredibly valuable is looking at the final analysis and saying, okay, in my experience, there are three things that you should consider, A, B, and C, and in my experience, this is what they should cost. And so this is another service that he is very helpful in providing a check on any remediation contracting that's going to happen. He knows that the price of aluminum should be about $41 per gram per meter squared applied to the sediment. And he knows that there are 2 or 3 companies in the Northeast that can do this. And so if you're buying an expensive product, it's great to have a consultant that can make sure you're getting the right value. He also adds credibility to the permitting process because he's done a lot of this over the years. And let's be very clear before you can do anything in a lake in Maine, because it's a public water body, you have to have a permit from the DEP. And so Ken was very helpful in working with DEP to help us with the permitting. So that gives you an idea of Ken Wagner. He's a great collaborator and someone that we've worked with now for a number of years. Danielle, do I need to add anything?
No, I think, I mean, the types of data that he will need to review and assess. Did we touch on that?
No, go ahead.
Well, it's just, so we're going to have, so Jody and MPA have been working to form a science committee, which Whitney and I will be on, but Ken will also be involved with to help nail down those data needs. The most obvious missing data we have right now is what the phosphorus coming in all the various tributaries is. So Ken, or none of us can really assess where stuff is coming from if we don't know how much is coming in from Leech Brook, from Bog Stream. I'm going to mess up some names, but, all the streams that enter North Pond, which is why North Pond is more complicated than East Pond, because East Pond doesn't have these tributaries. So not only do we have to measure the phosphorus, we actually also have to estimate the flow rates for them, because all that comes in during storm time. So we need to, it's not straightforward to get those estimates of those numbers. There's ways to do it, but it's going to take some work. And so that's one of the first things that we need to do in terms of data we don't already have, and data that Ken said we need to have to help assess this problem, which, Winnie and I know that too, that's data that we need to assess what the best management strategy might be. But so that's some of the type of data we need to collect before we can move on in that process. So next up, we have, what are the worst contributors of phosphorus? Fertilizing, are all fertilizers equally bad? Do we have maps of the area which feeds into North Pond, not just lakefront owners, but the whole basin? So it's multiple questions, but Whitney's going to take this one.
Okay, so the answer is you shouldn't be fertilizing in the shoreland zone, period. Let's just get there. No fertilizer. That's a completely stupid idea. Having said that, there are differences in fertilizer, and if you take the bag of fertilizer, it'll give you 3 numbers, and one is nitrogen, one is phosphorus, and one is potassium. And so 10-10-10 has 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, 10% potassium. Most lawn fertilizers are high in nitrogen and have no phosphorus. So that's better than putting 10, 10, 10 on your lawn. So you can actually look at the bag and determine how much phosphorus is in it. Nitrogen is not currently driving the bloom in North Pond, but adding nitrogen to your lawn is still not a good idea, because one of the things you'll likely do is trigger a metaphyton bloom, which is the slimy stuff on the bottom, if you give it a lot of extra nitrogen. So no fertilizer. That's just crazy. So let's see. What are the worst contributors to phosphorus? So fertilizer could be, but hopefully we're not going to worry about that. And then what needs to happen in terms of partitioning the external load, so that, remember, the external load is all the phosphorus that comes from around the outside of the lake, is that it needs to be a detailed shoreline survey. And these are not perfect, but they're better than not having a survey, where you basically walk and survey the entire shore of the lake. And there are estimates for how much phosphorus will come out of a forested stretch of shore lakefront versus a lawn versus a well-buffered camp. And that will allow us to partition areas of the lake that are the biggest source of phosphorus and those that are the lowest source of phosphorus. And then Danielle's last response is really important. The streams are also a major player in phosphorus loading. And so we need to not only measure the concentration in the water, but also the amount of water. You multiply those two numbers together and you get the phosphorus load.
And we are working, we have a Colby class who's actually going to work on that as their field lab in the autumn, actually. So we'll try and get some preliminary numbers. So they'll be working with me and a geology professor at Colby. We're going to try and estimate some of those flow rates and phosphorus loads. So yeah, so hopefully we'll get some preliminary numbers from that.
Okay. Danielle, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, sure. So can you speak to the potential risks and benefits, strictly within the context of water quality, of opening the Great Meadow Stream Dam in an attempt to flush the lake, given we've had an algae bloom for 3 consecutive years now? So that's the first part of the question. And then the next is, how might a lower lake level or more volume or consistent stream flow impact what's going on and why we've been having algal blooms? So the first thing is the natural flushing rate of North Pond is 1 year. That means that's basically on average how long a parcel of water stays in the lake. So and if you empty the lake, that's how long it would take to fill up. So that means the water that's in here right now is not going to be the water that's in here next summer. What that means is, though, in between that time, there's going to be a whole bunch of runoff and water falling in the watershed that's continually filling it up. And that water, as it brings phosphorus in, that water is bringing phosphorus in. There's no doubt about it. And the best thing we can do now is try and do as much as we can to keep that from coming in. So that's why flushing the lake is already flushed on a yearly basis. And we continue to have this problem because there's too much phosphorus coming in from the watershed. Additionally, we know the sediments are an issue. Nothing's going to happen to the sediments if you flush the lake either. They're still going to be there. There's still going to be a big mass of organic matter and dead and decaying algae that's going to consume oxygen once the next year starts going. So flushing the lake doesn't, because it already has a pretty fast flushing rate, even if you could feasibly do it, I don't actually think you could feasibly do it with the dam at Great Meadow Stream. But it won't have the water quality impact you'd think of, just because the lake water is going to come back in where it's coming from. So the lake flushes naturally once a year. That means we need to fix problems in the watershed as we go along, because water now is going to leave, but more water is coming in with phosphorus in it. The next bit is about if a lower lake level might impact what's going on. And the problem with the lower lake level is that it can expose sediments that normally aren't exposed, and then you have erosion processes that can work on those sediments on the shoreline, right? So right now, it's hitting sand, like I've seen the sandy beaches where the sand's been pushed up by the ice, but that's sand. Sand doesn't really have a lot of phosphorus in it. But if you start lowering the lake level, what gets eroded might start to be sediments that have phosphorus in them. So you might actually increase the phosphorus coming in to the lake. You know, on the flip side, a shallower lake mixes more often, but when your sediments are this organic, right, all this stuff falling down to the bottom, they're gonna be anoxic within the sediments pretty much no matter what you do at this point. So, so it won't take much for the stratification and anoxia and phosphorus release process to start again. So really we need to work on controlling things at the source and potentially talking about what we're going to do with the sediments as we go along through the process. Do you have anything to add, Whitney?
The only one point, which is if you were trying to manipulate the lake level to export phosphorus, you'd have to do it when the phosphorus is highest, which right now is in the middle of the summer. And so there's other issues with, even if it could work, and it's highly unlikely it would, you're gonna be messing with lake level when people expect the lake to be at full pond, right? So there's all sorts of logistical issues with dam control, right?
Yeah,
Nobody wants the lake to be 2 feet lower right now.
Yeah, there's legal obligations too, right? So,
yeah, well, we didn't even talk about the permitting, which would be crazy.
Okay, so next one Winnie's going to take is I've done runoff control measures over the years on my property using natural leaves and pine needles to slow down runoff in a couple of key areas before it hits my vegetative barriers. But I'd like to redo and expand some of them with bark mulch or wood chips. Any suggestions on what to use?
Yeah, so I've been doing the same thing on our camp, and I actually like the natural brown mulch that I get at Mackenzie's in Winslow. There is erosion control mulch, which is better on a steeper slope because it has larger pieces of bark and some actually gravel mixed in with it. So it tends to hold in place. That's what the state likes to use in areas where they're prone to erosion. I don't find it very aesthetic. I find it hard on the feet. And there's got to be a compromise between sort of recreational value and conservation, because you really need to do both of those things, right? You want people to enjoy their property and to minimize their runoff. And so I like the softer, slightly smaller natural brown mulch. It also blends well with the pine needles so that it creates a very natural surface. And I also like blueberry sod as an option because it actually creates an intact buffer. And so, you know, as you come away from the lake, you might start with some blueberry sod, some natural plantings, and then where you have more traffic areas, move to the mulch. And again, look for areas where you have direct runoff going into the lake, where you have channeling of water, and that's the best indicator of where you need to divert water and apply additional water control measures like mulch.
So next question we've already answered. So this one actually I'm going to give to you, Whitney, too, just because you've been in the watershed longer than me. It seems like we have so few people in North Pond Association that we would never get enough money to actually get a treatment done. So are there any grants or anything available that we could apply for?
So I can speak to how the East Pond Association raised the money for their alum treatment, and they did this in a couple of different ways. They received 319 money, which is US EPA money that's passed through the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. And it was the first time that 319 money had been used for a in-lake treatment. Most of the time 319 money is used for things like road and shoreline improvement. And the North Pond Association's been a benefit of that 319 money. I think from your annual meeting, up something on the order of $200,000. And the East Pond treatment received, I think, $300,000 of 319 money. So that was a third or maybe 25% of the treatment costs. They also worked with the Seven Lakes Alliance to receive a grant. And so the grant actually went to the Seven Lakes Alliance through some private philanthropy. And then they also raised money by basically going around to the watershed and saying, you know, we'd like you to donate 2 to 3% of the value of your property toward this treatment. Now, that's a lot of money. Most people go, whoa, that 2 to 3%, you know, that's probably half of what you would pay in taxes every year, or maybe equivalent to what you would pay in taxes every year on your property. So that's a big chunk of money. The return on that is that if the bloom goes away, your properties immediately appreciate 20 to 30%. So that was the tactic that Jerry Tipper used to raise a lot of money on East Pond. He said, I want 2 to 3% of the value of your property, and if this works, it's going to raise your property values 20%. That's a good return on investment. Now,
Dr. King, just to interject, a couple of us met with Jerry this morning to pick East Pond's brain to see what they did do for fundraising so that we didn't have to reinvent the wheel, because, and also Linda from the DEP has chimed in. And for instance, the little chart she sent me, we have about 350 camps on the lake. And if everybody gave $100, you know, we'd have this much money. If everybody gave 1,000, we'd have 300, you know, 300,000, over $300,000. So that's $1,000 each for, you know, over $250,000. So she just is putting it in perspective. So as in the next couple of weeks, the fundraising committee will be put together, and we have to decide if we're, you know, because we're not ready to do remediation, if we should do like a two-phase fundraising, or if we should just do, you know, a fundraising after we get all the particulars from Dr. Wagner and you and Danielle for what we could do to remediate and how much it would be. I personally would like to start fundraising now for the whole.
Jody, I couldn't agree with you more. I think one of the benefits that East Pond had was they had a well-formulated plan with a budget that they were fundraising for. So that helped them, right?
And the thing that Jerry offered was they already had all of their research in when they went to ask. And his point to me about waiting for the big fundraiser was that people want to see exactly what their money's going to get them. And, you know, we have that big question mark of what are we going to get for this money, because we don't know, because we still need a year of research.
You have nailed it, right? There's a chicken and the egg component to this, and it's going to take some resources to develop a good plan. We know that the external load control has to happen, or you just waste your internal load control, right? You've got to deal with the shoreline, because that's where all the phosphorus came from to start with. And then once you have that sort of under control, then a in-lake treatment then potentially makes a lot of sense. And so, but that is how they raise the money. And it seems like a great strategy for North Pond to pursue.
We have some other ideas too.
Yeah. I mean, you know, because I was working on the East Pond component of a treatment for maybe 10 years. And for about 8 of those 10 years, everybody said, well, we could never raise this money. We can never do an in-lake treatment. They did the perch removal because the state of Maine was paying for it as kind of an experiment. And then all of a sudden, the attitude changed and they said, nope, we're going to do this. Here's the plan, raise the money. And they did it in probably, well less than a year. I would say
8 months. He said about 8 months.
8 months. Yeah. But it took a change of attitude. And once sort of people changed their mindset, it happened very quickly. But you're absolutely right. They had a clear target, and that was super helpful in raising money.
And what is the coming to the lake with a clean lake worth to you every year?
Yep.
Okay, I'll go off now.
There's a follow-up question that's directly related. There's some other questions too. We'll be sure to get to those, but specifically it's asking why does it take a year to test? And part of it is we need to capture the spring runoff to really understand the phosphorus dynamics in the lake. So we need to be doing sampling and attempting to estimate some of these flow rates coming through the tributaries and the culverts in the springtime, because that's when we get snow melt and rain. So we want to understand how much phosphorus is coming from the watershed. We need to have spring measurements. And we were actually, we had talked about doing that this year before this, but with COVID, we're very understaffed in terms of we don't have our interns that we usually have from Colby. We just don't have the hands we didn't have the hands for doing everything we would have liked to do this spring. But to be here, we've been out on North Pond doing measurements, regularly before 2018, but since 2018, North Pond has been one of our most studied lakes. Like honestly, we've been out there every week. In 2018 and in 2019, our students were out there every week. We were trying to be out there every week doing measurements to get at some of these questions. And we had set up things to do things in the springtime, but there's a pandemic going on and that didn't happen this spring. So we're planning to make sure it happens this coming spring. And part of having the science committee formed is that, is so that we have a team of people, not just, Danielle and Whitney do some stuff for us, right? Like we need to have a team of people who are going to help with some of these measurements so that they can be done. And so that's why, people want quick answers. Unfortunately, we can't just get all the data right now. We have a lot of data though that we've collected. So we have a lot of the answers. It's the watershed inputs that we need to start clarifying and refining. Do you have anything to add about why it takes that long, Whitney?
Well, I'll just go on to the next question. Can you estimate the percentage of external versus internal phosphorus contribution to the lake? That is why so we need to know that number, and we need to know those numbers, and we need to know them not only averaged over the year, but we need to know by month how much is coming external versus internal. And now you have a blueprint for what are you going to do about it. And that's why it takes a year, because it's complicated and you're spending a large amount of people's precious resources to do this. So you really want to get it right. That's not the quick fix, but a successful treatment should last 20 years. So that's why it takes a year of planning. And the permitting process, you can start that process now, but it won't be finished until you have a detailed remediation plan.
And I think following up, the next question about will the treatment used on East Pond work in North Pond, it kind of follows up on that. And part of that is something like alum always works initially. It always will strip phosphorus out of the water. It takes the algae with it. It's whether or not it's going to last 2 years or 20 years. No one goes around bragging about the treatments that lasted 2 years, which is why you don't hear about them so often, but they exist. There's plenty of lakes where this has happened. And that's why we need to do the science right, because, if you're going to raise $3 million, you need that to last more than 3 years, right? I think fundamentally that's why we need this basic science work to make sure that's the right remediation strategy, and that all the science that goes in deciding how much alum you need, et cetera. That's, the reason we are very optimistic about East Pond is because so much work went into estimating that, how much aluminum was needed for that lake. And so that requires time and effort, right? So it isn't a quick, just a back of the envelope calculation, buy some aluminum, oh, it'll be fine, right? That's not, it's more complicated than that. And it's particularly more complicated because we don't know how much phosphorus is just going to rush back in from the tributaries in North Pond, which East Pond does not have. Do you have anything to add to that, Whitney?
No, I'll just offer, if anyone's interested in learning more about the mechanics of the alum addition, we've got some great slides of how that worked on East Pond. I think that's a bit premature now, but if it turns out that alum's a treatment that's worth considering in the future, then we have an advantage that we did it, we documented it, we spent every day behind the treatment boats. So we answer a lot of questions people will have if and when that becomes an option. Is it possible to find the worst offending external sources of phosphorus so to concentrate the efforts on remediation? The answer is yes. That's what a watershed survey is designed to do. And so one of the first things that should be planned is a watershed survey, which walks around the watershed and looks for the offending properties, streams, roads.
I have this was done in 2017, is that right? When was the watershed survey done, Jody? Okay, she's muted at the moment, but they did one somewhat recently. Whether or not it's up to date enough, and I believe
2017. Sorry, I was on mute.
Yeah, so this did identify some of the high risk sites. So I mean that's something the North Pond Association has to work on, following up on those sites.
90 people received letters.
But, never people receive letters, of course. I mean, I don't know what the best strategy for following up even farther, but, the lake's green, so hopefully that's motivation.
Well, and one of the issues, one of the problems we'll have, in identifying, are people do they want to be identified? Do they want to work on their shoreline with help from the Lake Association? I mean, we had the Are You Buff Enough workshops. We gave back $150 for any amount of money you spent. Show us your receipt. We give you $150 if you attend a workshop that teaches you how to plant plants and what their purposes are and things like that. And so when you're identified as a high risk area on the lake for, phosphorus runoff, and maybe you did something and maybe you didn't, I don't know. Maybe you did something by yourself. So, I mean, if people can, if they want to reach out, I'm not judging anybody. I'm having a Lake Smart screen tomorrow on my property because I know I can do more, even though I've done a lot. So, I mean, it's what you personally want to do. Hold yourself accountable. What more can I do? Just don't mow your grass 10 feet back from the shoreline if you have a lawn all the way. It's called a grass mat, and it slows a lot of the phosphorus down. Anyway, I'm off my soapbox.
So just a follow-up on that. How do we follow up on the high-risk sites? They're actually in the plan. They're listed by address. So there is, they are identified by risk level, and that was done. So I think, working with landowners if people aren't voluntarily engaging with YCC or Lake Smart once they've been identified as high risk, I think, Whitney and I have probably both said this, that the science is almost the easy part of this. It's the social side of getting everybody on board with what needs to be done is what one of the challenges is. I just wanted another follow-up question about if we can use volunteers, since considering we are short-staffed. And actually, we definitely, okay, so Jody accidentally emailed me privately, but messaged me privately.
Oh, sorry.
She just says, if you want to know if you're high or moderate or low risk, you can email her. But in terms of volunteers, so this goes back to Louise's question at the beginning, is whether or not she and Deb Cunningham, I believe it is, need to be out every week. And actually, yes, because we've been trying to go out to do SECI disc measurements every week. But we don't always get out, and we really rely on this bloom changes so quickly that so Deb and Louise are certified lake monitors. So certainly recommend if someone's interested in actually helping with in-lake measurements, that's something that they get certified to do once Lake Stewards and Wain is doing that again. One of the things in the spring and possibly in the autumn is going to be volunteers to help us take phosphorus samples in the tributary. So Jody and I attempted to set up these auto samplers to do it. I think
It was comical. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm covered, and my leg is all scraped up from falling in the serpentine. But you know, they don't work. We can't get them right, and they're actually quite awkward and clunky. And I think and the bottles aren't chemically clean, is what I realized after setting it all up. So it probably is easier to have volunteers who go out and take samples during storm events. And so we have like a monitor network. We say, okay, it's raining. We need people to go collect samples these days. So we need to come up with a plan for that.
Preferably people who live near the tributaries so that they can just scoot out and get back in.
Exactly. So as we start developing a plan volunteers will be very much appreciated for some of these measurements, because you know we can't take care of it all ourselves. So let's see. Sorry, Whitney, what?
I'll just add that the same would be true for the toxin testing.
Mm-hmm.
Right, having a few people that would spend some time with Danielle and get comfortable with the test. I think the more people around North Pond that are engaged in monitoring, it creates conversation, it creates confidence in the numbers, it creates a more well-informed constituency, and all of these things are positive, both from a scientific and from a social science standpoint.
Okay, so let's see here. Okay. Do you want to talk about stages of algae blooms, Whitney? Or do you want?
Sure. I will give you a really short synopsis here. And the most important thing to recognize is that algae do go through a natural boom and bust cycle over the course of the summer. So typically, right after ice out, we get a diatom bloom, and diatoms make their houses out of silica. And they're really cool looking under the microscope. If you look at the lake, you'll notice it's a little bit brown in color, and it can be quite brown if you have a large diatom bloom, but they don't produce toxins, and they don't tend to accumulate at concentrations that create sort of recreational, they're not unpleasant. The blooms are not as unpleasant as the Anabina blooms. But the Secchi was almost 2 meters this spring. I mean, the water was quite turbid while these organisms were blooming, and then they die out. And when they die out, they take a lot of the phosphorus and, more importantly, the silica, because they make their houses out of silica. So they make glass houses. Silica goes to the bottom. The diatoms come out, and the zooplankton, which are the animals, will feed on them, and so they help to remove the diatoms. And then the water clears out, and that's what you had in June. Is you had fairly clear water conditions, and that typically lasts June through the end of July in our sort of polymictic, multiple mixing lakes like East Pond and North Pond. And then at the end of July, so June and July are clear. At the end of July, the internal load kicks up, and you get the second bloom of the year, which is typically blue-green algae. They don't need silica, and more importantly, they don't need nitrogen. They get the nitrogen from the atmosphere. All they need is phosphorus. We give them enough phosphorus, and they take over the lake. So there's 2 bloom cycles. One in the spring, nobody complains about that. They're not on the lake. And then one in August. And of course, as everyone on North Pond knows, your bloom started really early this year. And so the bloom could persist now for quite a few more weeks. So there's lots more we can say about it, but that's the sort of big picture. 2 blooms, one in the spring, one at the end of the summer, and clear water in between.
And I did just want to add, you know, the science of when toxins are produced is really still very unknown, but it tends to be seen more when they're starting to bloom, when they're kind of building up, they're being productive, basically multiplying, and then also when they die off. So, which kind of goes to the next question is about the milky gray blue all over. From my understanding is that the cells release pigments when they release their pigments when they die, and they're called blue-green algae for a reason, right? So that's what the bluish greenish, because right now you look at North Pond from, Jody sent me some pictures where it's green, and then you have this like turquoise green color as well. And from my understanding, that's more dead cells compared to the brighter green colors of the live cells. So does that mean it's getting better or worse as they're changing color? It means you're having cells dying, which means we have to be on top of the toxin monitoring. But, you know, we have another hot spell this week, so they're just going to replace themselves. So we might get a different kind of blue-green algae than what we have now, but we're still probably going to have it as long as the weather stays as hot as it is. Yeah, so I don't know if we're getting better or worse at this point. We're probably in a stagnating zone, so, which I know is not what people want to hear, but so next question is, have you tested Little North Pond? If so, is it safe to swim in Little North? Whitney was out there just the other day, correct?
That is correct. The transparency in Little North is decreasing, but it is still 7 to 8 feet. The phosphorus concentration in Little North is much lower. It is 25 to 30% lower than it is in the main North Pond. And the blue-green bloom is substantially less. And the easiest way to see that is from a aerial photograph, which we can share. And Jody, you probably have already seen these. You can see from the plane, Little North is brown and North Pond is green. And that's really the difference. And so the answer to the specific question, would you swim in the lake? I think the answer is, yeah, it would be okay to swim in Little North Pond. There is a little bit of a bloom going on, but it's much less than what's in North Pond.
So quick question, what causes a change in increase in turbidity? And that's going to be sediment runoff, resuspension from boat motors, but also algae changes the turbidity as well. So the next one is, is aeration a treatment plan? And I'll answer this one just because I've had a lot of experience with aeration, and aeration generally works best in deep lakes that are stratified all year, all summer. In shallow lakes like North Pond, you can actually have some unintended consequences, and algae cyanobacteria are very good at adapting, and they're like, ooh, you just mixed us around. We'll figure this out and figure out how to still thrive. So aeration is generally not considered the best option for a shallow lake like North Pond. Someone also asked in the questions about dredging. Dredging is also one of these other alternatives for treatment that we talk about. Dredging is very expensive, is one thing, although getting rid of all the offending sediment certainly can help. It's very expensive. It's a large area in North Pond that would need to be dredged. That basically makes that not a very feasible solution from what I know. But so anyway, I thought we'd talk about those other two treatment methods. Whitney, do you have anything to add about those?
No, let's keep going.
Okay, so the next question, is it coincidental that East Pond's treatment occurs at the same time as North Pond's algal bloom? And I think the answer is yes, that is coincidental. Yeah, East Pond did not influence North Pond. If anything, we'd expect it to be clearer after East Pond's treatment. So next question is about the dam again. So I think we've already discussed that. So the next question is about stirring up of sediments from wake boats and other slow moving activities such as tubing, and can that have an effect? And the reality is yes. So boating, if it's kicking up sediments, can contribute phosphorus into the water column. And yeah, so it can help reduces the water clarity, which means you end up more likely to have stratification. So, which then leads to your anoxia. So boats can be part of the problem, and it's important that people respect the 200-foot rule at a minimum. I think, I can't remember if it was, what lake it was on in the Seven Lakes. Maybe it was McGraw or something, where they put up a 200-foot buoy somewhere where they hadn't before, and people were just astonished by how far away 200 feet is, that people misjudge that quite a lot. But, you know, so we've been doing some work on East Pond. We did some work last summer on East Pond with wake boats. And basically, if your water's shallower than 10 feet, the wake boats can kick up the sediments as well. Other boats a little shallower, but see, the Keyser Lake Association recommends 500 feet away from shoreline for any wake boat operation. So these things can impact it, and you have to be, you know, be a smart boater. We have lake smart. I think we need wake smart. Everyone get a little badge that says they understand what they need to do to reduce their wakes and minimize impacts on water quality. Do you have anything to add, Whitney?
Nope.
Okay.
No,
If people want to specifically target the people that are doing that, get your binoculars out, write down the numbers. The game wardens would love to be able to go and talk to the people. And there's also possible legislation to increase jet ski wakes to 400 feet from the shoreline. It's in talks.
So if you go to the Seven Lakes Alliance webpage, Danielle has a presentation on the impact of wake boats on sediments, right? I think I saw that, Danielle.
I think I'll double check to make sure I think it probably been posted in the past, but I'll make sure that it's tagged on our blog section, so let me get that up there. So I was going to say, with the next question, there's a lot of people who are asking about sunset camps, and this isn't necessarily the place, this is a science discussion, and the main things that I want to point out are, there's no one thing that made North Pond start blooming. It's a sum of actions over years that led to the phosphorus levels to keep it on the edge, so that it could be road erosion, it could be, there's so many different things, and so at this point we need to deal with solving the problem, not like pointing fingers, because everyone contributed to North Pond's current state, right? So I think that's the important thing. And so, you know, the DEP approves permits legally. They're not illegal permits. Dredging can increase phosphorus, but responsible work. People do dredging on streams all over the place in the Belgrades. If you do it responsibly, you can minimize the inflow of sediments into the lake. And then finally, the increase of people. Anywhere we have an increase of people, is going to have more use on the septics. These things can increase phosphorus. So it also means, you know, people who are renting out their houses regularly, who may have more people in there over the course of the summer than they used to, who use the camp longer than they used to, all these things will contribute to more stuff going into septic systems which go into the lake at some point. So there's a lot of various different things. And, you know, at this point, we have no evidence of any one specific action being the cause, so we're not, you know, there's no point in trying to point fingers at people, is what, we're not going to get through this if people want to blame someone for what's going on. So that's, I guess, the way I would answer that question, because it's come up multiple times, and I don't know if Whitney, if you have something you want to add to that.
No, I was actually going to take the septic question, because we're running late on time, and
Okay.
we've got 2 more to go. Is there a way for lakefront owners to test their septic systems, or does it not need to be done professionally? There's some practical things that people can do right away. If you have a leaky system, you know, if there's a obvious leak or an obvious wet area that forms when you have a lot of people using the septic, then you probably have a problem. Many of our septic systems are in sand or in gravel, and they'll never fail in the sense that the liquid will come to the surface because it'll just run through the sand and gravel. And those are going to need to be tested professionally. And this is actually not as easy as it sounds. The average septic installer isn't in the business of testing to see if phosphorus is leaking into the lake. That's not what they do. They're following well-prescribed procedures approved by the state to site and maintain septic systems. So for sure, there are septic systems around North Pond and all the lakes in Maine that have failed or are going to fail, and they need to be upgraded. And so one of the things that the North Pond Association can do is take an inventory of all the septic systems and try to identify those that are the most at risk. And that is going to require a level of professional assessment. It's not as simple as flushing something down the toilet and seeing it in the lake. That just doesn't work. So it's a complicated question, and one that's going to have to be addressed in the context of the external load calculations.
So I guess, yeah, just the last question on the list that we've already talked about the other ones, I think, is how it affects native plant growth and wildlife such as osprey, turtles, loons. Well, plants, we can tell you, if you cut off sunlight, most vegetation is not going to live, right? And actually contribute to the problem once you have vegetation and then the sunlight kills it. no sunlight leads to it dying. It contributes to that organic matter on the bottom. I mean, we still see that. I think loons look quite striking on a green lake. I don't know what the they can also be susceptible to the same toxins that we can be. So if it does become toxic, then you can certainly have impacts on the animal and wildlife in the lake. Do you have anything to add about that, Wendy?
No, it's the loons seem to do just okay. But I don't know of any study which has looked at sort of loon populations on lakes that regularly bloom versus those that don't. There are other factors like habitat, shoreline habitat, that are really important for the loons, and then the fish population that they can feed on is important. So that one is important. If you ever go down the path of treatment, one of the things we really had to pay attention to on East Pond was that the addition of aluminum didn't kill fish or any wildlife. And so we spent a lot of time going around the lake looking for impacts on fish or birds, and we didn't see any. We did, over the entire treatment, recover, I think, less than 20 dead fish, and I think half of them had a fish hook in their mouth. So it was it's really important to pay attention to the wildlife, both now and in the future. But I think right now it's not the most pressing problem.
So there's a few more questions in the comments, and I know it's getting late. I'm happy to just kind of take care of them since we're here. Most of them seem pretty quick, I think. The first is about, can you somehow filter out the phosphorus? And I'm guessing that means the phosphorus running in from the tributaries. Being lake smart and putting in buffers filters out the phosphorus on your property. There are erosion control methods, for instance, for runoff coming from the roads that have been implemented, but perhaps there's ways to make, there might be other things that can be done which allow more of the phosphorus, basically more of the sediment to settle down before it hits the lake, so it doesn't bring the phosphorus in with it. So, so that's certainly something to look into on a larger scale. Let's see here. Can you comment on the possible impact of climate change with record high temperatures and the impact of the algal bloom? Cyanobacteria love hot weather, so it's not going to get, climate change certainly is going to exacerbate things, and that's why we need to get the phosphorus levels down as much as we can to help minimize that. let's see here. So there's a couple plans about making sure we plan for ice out and for sampling. And so that's what the science committee will come up with this autumn, and we'll put some practice in place for fall storms to make sure we can capture those events. And then so that way we're ready for the spring to collect that spring data. Let's see here. Have we? Okay, now this is, there's a bunch of questions there, so we might have to, there are actually a bunch more questions that I haven't caught up with, so I might have to, might just have to add them to the document and answer them in the document, just because I thought there's only a few, but there's probably another 10 questions, and some of them are a little more involved. So it's not that we don't want to answer them, it's just that it's getting pretty late. And yeah, so yeah, any final thoughts, Whitney?
No, I think this is helpful, and you know, it's we probably wouldn't be able to do this every week, but this is the kind of opportunity that is really helpful as you move forward, and it keep people plugged in. And if there's any consolation to the COVID pandemic, it's that we all know how to jump on a Zoom call now and ask some questions. And so if it's helpful, we could do this again, maybe after the science committee has had a chance to, you know, go through the first pass on all the data and start to formulate some concrete analysis and recommendations. And then we could do this type of opportunity, you know, call in, particularly in the winter when people are distributed. It's a way for everyone to come back and get together and answer questions, which we just couldn't do before.
Jody, do you have any kind of final things you want to say?
Well, I'm reading some of the other questions. I mean, you know, people do not like some of the things going on and around the lake, and, you know, we all just have to get along, and whether we like it or not, we're all in this together. So I you know, hopefully this Zoom meeting has given people some clarity and a direction to go in. And, you know, the North Pond Association, it does all that it can do, and we're trying to work with people. We're getting groups together of people around the lake to join committees. And thank you so much for everybody that is volunteering. You know, just hang in there, everyone, and we'll get this done. Thank you to Danielle and Dr. King.
And yeah, I guess if you want to get involved, I think, you know, in terms of volunteering, I guess you can shoot, if you're on the science side, shoot me and Jody an email. For other things with North Pond Association, definitely shoot Jody an email. Sorry, I just volunteered to shoot, but yeah, so certainly if you want it, there's lots of ways to get involved to help work on this together.
It's true.
Okay, well,
Good night, folks.
it has been recorded, and we'll
you don't want to volunteer for a committee, just make sure you're, you know, planting some buffer.
yeah. Okay.